Well, welcome everybody to the Menlo Midweek podcast. My name is Mark, and Jeremy's with us again today for our little intro.
Hello, everybody. How you doing?
I'm so glad you're here, Jeremy. You helped out with our recording with Phil that we're going to dive into in just a second. But first, we have to remind people of what I'm doing for our online community at the end of this month on the 27th. That's the Saturday from 7 to 9 p.m. We're having a little basketball hangout here in Menlo Park. And Jeremy, are you a basketball player?
I'm not a basketball player, but that's not going to stop me from coming over to hang out.
Awesome. And we would love to use this opportunity for those that might be newer to Menlo, new to Menlo, full stop new to Menlo, or for those there at Menlo that want to bring their friends to an event to just hang out, play basketball together. And so super excited for that. And also this was the last weekend for us to put our backpacks out and for that. So Jeremy, thank you for you and your team down in Saratoga for all your help with that. We were able to bless a lot of people there, and some of the kids, I just have their minds permanently in my brain as with their excitement of picking these up. And so we've got a lot of stuff coming up too, including a little volunteer day that we're doing later that month as well.
Yeah, late August, all the volunteers are going to be hanging out on a Saturday instead of a Sunday, so no excuse not to come. And we'll hang out, watch some videos, learn about each other, interact, make friends, hopefully invite new people. We'll see.
So be on the lookout for that. You might have heard that news here first. But yes, people that are awesome and warm and welcoming, just like Jeremy, are all going to be there. So whether you're on a team now or you are thinking about joining a team to help kick off our fall, all the things we have going on in fall, be on the lookout for that. You can get more information at your campus. And now let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Phil. Well, welcome everybody to the Menlo Midweek podcast. My name is Mark.
And I'm Phil.
And we're going to start this podcast just diving into something that I haven't talked to you enough about yet, Phil. But we need to talk about your time fly fishing.
Yep, that's where I was last week.
Yes.
It was my 6th year going to a place called The Refuge in Fort Smith, Montana. It's like a location where ministry leaders and spouses of ministry leaders will go. So I've been with a group of these guys for 6 years, and then some people are new every year. But it's like 15, 17 of us.
Right.
And you go hang out. Like I literally delete work apps from my phone. It's like the most disconnected week I have of the year. And you get to rest and recover and talk about life. And then, you spend, depending on the day, anywhere from 6 to, 10 hours fly fishing on the Bighorn River.
Crazy.
Which is an incredible place to fly fish. And you're doing it with guides that do this all day, every day in like a float boat. And so if they go past a section and you get a bite, even if you mess it up, I never would, but if somebody else, doesn't get it, they will re-row literally all day just to like put you on that same deal, or they'll be like, oh, let me change out your setup, and they'll give you a different fly. Or if you, again, I would never, but get a tangle, they'll fix that for you. So when someone like Mark, who is a legit fly fisherman, says to me, do you enjoy fly fishing? I go, well, like the 3% of it that's incredible, that requires little to no personal skill, and all the annoying stuff is gone. I love that 3% of fly fishing. So the idea of like tying my own ties or having to like fix my own problems on the water, like those things seem less fun to me, but it's a really sweet time. And it definitely feels like you're able to simultaneously like kind of pour out a bunch of stress and then get filled up with some community and rest too. So, and I always take like one day out of the 5 days of the trip. I take one day to do nothing. Like I literally just chill, because that
probably has to be the hardest thing for you to do, knowing you. And, but also the most filling thing for you to do.
It's really helpful. I did like do a long run on that day, but
I didn't do anything about
it. That's. But like even for me to be able to do that and like come back and listen to something or take a nap or read, like that's all. I just don't normally do that. So it was great. It was a really 6 years in. I feel like I've got what that process is pretty dialed in, and I was glad to be able to do it.
So we have a generous orthodoxy here at Menlo. Is it safe to say that fly fishing is a spiritual discipline? Can we add that in?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
They call it indicator therapy. Have you ever heard that phrase before?
No.
So at the refuge, your bobber, they don't call it a bobber because that's lowbrow. They call it an indicator.
Right.
And one of the guys that I went with is super hardcore, and he uses balloons, like little balloons as bobbers, like this small little latex thing. He's like, it lands softer on the water. It looks brighter. It was awesome, actually. And it was like this crazy. He's like, it's a big deal, like in fly fishing now. It's like, okay, bro, whatever you need.
Sure.
But, there's this idea of like, oh, man, I've got so much happening in my head and so much. And, I mean, when you're fly fishing, you are just looking at that orange little ball on the surface of the water, just waiting for it to do kind of anything. Like, and when you grew up, like bass fishing, you almost are waiting for that kind of thing to just like go out of the water.
Right.
And fly fishing, if it just even moves kind of in a way that feels non-normal, you strike. And so, anyway, it was fun, and I'm glad to be able to do it. It was, it's a great rhythm. So I never know if I'll get to do it again. Every year is kind of a unique invite.
Yeah.
But I'm glad I got to this year.
Yeah. And then you get back to us here at Menlo. Stuff still went on when you were gone, Phil.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear
as
that.
it should have. And thank you for setting us up well in that. We had a wonderful conversation with Aisha and Scott last week. That was super fun. And then unfortunately, I think we still do need to discuss a little bit of an assassination attempt as well, and we got that a little bit more space. We've talked about that over the weekend in our services, but haven't talked about it here on the podcast yet. So where do you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think hopefully if you weren't praying around this political season, that reminds you of the necessity and power of prayer. And no matter where you are in the political divide, I hope we can all agree that political violence has no place in this conversation as followers of Jesus, figuring out what it means to embrace a way of talking about even things with which we disagree with charity and kindness, where we can listen well. Obviously we did a series called Smear Campaign already just a few weeks ago, kind of in preparation for this political season that felt heated for sure, but I don't think any of us were anticipating an act of political violence. Right. Obviously, the nation is grieving the loss of one life of a retired fire chief who laid his body on top of his family to protect. I mean, just unthinkable heroism. Someone else, I believe, maybe two other people were injured. And then obviously former President Trump, it's been well documented how close it was to that taking his life. So I think I'm praying that both sides of this political conversation dial down the rhetoric. I think that it's very easy to lead out of a place of fear. And so this place of like, hey, if they win, then this awful, unthinkable end of the world event is going to happen. No, if they win, then this unthinkable, awful end of the world is going to happen. And I think it's really actually helpful for me at Menlo to talk to people, men and women who have been following Jesus for decades. And there's a version where they're like, hey, we were told that this is likely the last election so many times in our lifetime. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think our rhetoric has just gotten out of control. And we have a choice, I think, as followers of Jesus, to hopefully engage in this. We may not be able to change the national political platform. We may not be able to fix a national convention of one party or the other. But I think in the way we talk about this, we can be more precise in the words that we say. We can be more charitable with whom we disagree. And I mentioned this last week, a book recommendation, Learning to Disagree by John Inazu. And I would just say if you are looking for more than kind of the magnet, more than the series, you're going, what's my next step? That could be a great book to say, how do I have a conversation with someone, disagree in a way that doesn't require me to vilify them? I hope we're all looking for that while we're sincerely praying. The influence that God has given the United States of America in the world is kind of an unparalleled level of influence. And so for us, it's not just how does this affect my life, but it's what are the geopolitical ramifications of political violence like this in America around the world? Who are the people whose lives will be different and maybe more vulnerable if this kind of rhetoric and these kinds of acts were to continue to be perpetuated. So pray that God's will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we have imperfect people, including imperfect parties and elections. You've heard me say this before. Neither political party has the moral high ground. Yeah. As ambassadors of the kingdom of heaven, we want to view our politics through the lens of our faith, and then informed by that, we vote our conscience. But nobody's named Jesus other than Jesus himself. And so we have to be careful not to turn our person that we're voting for into Jesus, and we have to be careful not to turn the person we're voting against into the devil, because I think that's exactly what the enemy of our souls would want us to be.
And if you're newer to Menlo, Phil mentioned a series that we did called Smear Campaign, where it was around how to see people that disagree with you not as evil, but as fellow brothers and sisters. And so if you need help in resources, in language, we had some great conversations, one with Dr. Condoleezza Rice as well around discourse. And so we have all those available for you online for you to go back and check at any point. And fortunately, it feels like the tensions around this political season are just ramping up too. So keep this top of mind. Phil, I have a question for you that I've heard from our online community and in my community as well. People wrestling with this idea that they're seeing online of God saving Trump.
Sure.
What are your thoughts around that? How can we navigate that? As we've discussed, both parties, yes, have no moral high ground, yet
Right.
We see that one claims to be chosen.
Right.
One does not, or however you want to say that. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think maybe we've talked about this before, but Menlo as a church, we hold to a theological paradigm called Reformed theology.
Yeah.
Reformed theology emphasizes the sovereignty of God, or the fact that God is in control of everything. And so the moment that I say that, you think, wait a second, what about the bad stuff? Well, philosophically, the way that people have described that within Reformed theology is the difference between first-class causation and second-class causation.
Okay.
So first-class causation sometimes gets called God's perfect will. So like God does specific things intentionally out of his desire. And then there's second-class causation, what sometimes gets called God's permissive will. Both of them, in a world where God is sovereign, he is sovereign over those things. But if the only thing God did was use perfect people, then none of us would get used, right?
Yep.
But it's also highlighted repeatedly throughout the Bible that God actually places global leaders, even the bad ones. Like he's actually using, whether it's first-class causation, somebody that's trying to do it God's way, or second-class causation, God is allowing it. He's using all of it. So I think the question of like, well, did God like save former President Trump? I think the question I might ask back would be, do you think I was surprised by it? Like, do you think it was like, oh man, Donald Trump dodged it, and so God kind of was like, oh gosh, glad you dodged it. Like, I think if God is genuinely sovereign, we can have the conversation, is that first-class causation, is that second-class causation, is it God's perfect will or God's permissive will? But this idea that like it just slipped by God, I can't think of a way to sort of theologically underpin that thinking from the scriptures. But I think that whatever has happened in your life, I would say there is a nature. Some people will go like, I don't know, maybe it was a coincidence. My theological convictions would be that there are no coincidences. There's only providence. And so, one of the biggest moments of this is when Jesus is with Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is trying to get Jesus at his trial to defend himself. And in order to do that, he says, Jesus, don't you realize, like, I have the power if I want, like, you live or you die because of me. And Jesus says, no, like, the only authority that you have comes from my Father. Right. And so I'm going to lay my life down and I'm going to pick it back up, right? So he's sort of, Pilate was not like a great God-loving Jewish man of the first century. Like, that was not what he was doing. And Jesus was like, and you are still specifically being used by God. You look at Pharaoh in the Old Testament, specifically when we go back to the Exodus, and God clearly used even the hardening of Pharaoh's heart for the ultimate deliverance of his people.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be careful. Like if you're somebody that the political figure we're talking about, whether it's former President Trump or someone else, and you're going, well, God can't use that person, I would say be careful, because whether it's the Roman Empire or, at the time Nero, or it's, we go back to Pharaoh, or it's Nebuchadnezzar. Like there are all these examples throughout the scriptures where God uses even imperfect, broken, evil leaders for a purpose that they don't even realize. Like that's definitively happening.
Yep.
And so God certainly still does that today. And then I think at the same time, you can go, well, I believe in this leader. I think he is God honoring and would make it awesome, man. Vote for that person. That's fantastic. But I think this idea of like God can only use the people that I agree with. God uniquely does that, and he doesn't use the other people. I think that's actually way more limiting of God than we think it is. So, this idea of like, did God save former President Trump? I think, again, my question back would be the alternative to God being sovereign over that situation and providentially preserving his life is that God was surprised by it, right? But I think by the same token, you have to say, if God was sovereign over the bullet going by President Trump, was he sovereign over the bullet going into that retired fire chief? Like we have to be intellectually honest about this.
Right.
And so can God use both? Yes. Does God use both? Yes. Does that idea leave us with tons of unanswered questions this side of eternity to say, God, I trust that you're in control, even in a broken world, even when things aren't working the way that they're supposed to, even when it involves grief and pain? Yeah, because what we know is God is not willing that any would perish, but that all would come to know him. He doesn't want any death, any disease. Like all of this exists inside of the spectrum of a broken world that God, out of God's patience, he's waiting to restore it. Because in that window of patience, he's hoping more and more people will choose to ultimately follow Jesus. He has this timeline by which he's seeing people redeemed, restored, and renewed to a relationship with him before the entire world is brought to restoration.
I love that. To make it clear that it's not, yes, we'll pray for leaders, or God will use imperfect people. Sure, I can get behind that all day.
Right.
But when that imperfect person is someone that I may or may not agree with, or may or may not like,
Right.
to take it that next step and say, no, God will still use that person.
Yep.
That's something that's going to,
I mean, when
get
we're
my
told
brain
to
going.
pray for our leaders, it doesn't say the ones you agree with.
Right.
It's all of them, right? We were studying for this kind of cohort thing we're doing with staff this week, and we were studying a passage where Jesus says, unless you hate your mother and father, your wife, your spouse, and your kids, you can't ultimately follow Jesus. And it was like a challenge of priority.
Yes.
And we spent some time studying that. And then at the same time, Jesus says, love your enemy. And so it's this like constant challenge of what we want to naturally do in our own flesh is elevate the people closest to us, probably to a level of idolatry, where we're putting them as a priority in our own life beyond what they should be, that they really can hold. And we want to devalue people that are our earthly neighbors, made in the image of God, that we consider our enemies. And Jesus is regularly saying, no, I'm the top shelf. That's how you've been built to be.
Right.
You can love people, but it's in relationship and connection to me. And as you love people, make sure that on that list are your enemies. And I wonder what it would look like if the paraphrase in 2024 would say, Jesus would say, you should love your political enemies. Like if just that one word was there, whether it's that person that you're definitely not going to vote for, or the people who are passionate about voting for them. And I think that challenge that we find ourselves in, you're right, is not going away. And I think if you didn't grab a magnet about how to listen well, I'm sure we have those available at every campus still. There's a bunch of resources connected to that series online. There's obviously digital resources that we made available. I know this is exhausting. I know it is. But I hope that Menlo continues to be a place that isn't just adding more gasoline to it, but that genuinely we can remind you that God is not surprised by any of it. He's in control. We can trust him, and we can be people that bring the hope of that everywhere we go.
Yeah. And speaking of control and trust, that's kind of what our talk started with and centered around this past weekend. Mm-hmm. Of basically how to live with what is in our lives now with the certainty that God has it and that God is holding that. And so for those that missed it, Phil, can you run through your message a bit and then let's dive in?
Yeah. So, Scott last week really kind of teed it up. Like when you think about this passage, verse 12 and 13 starts to make this transition from where we've been around, hey, we're going to live according to the Spirit,
right,
not according to the flesh. We're going to have this adoption as children of God, kind of Abba Father, that like God's our dad. And that as a result of that, there's this thing that he finishes with in verse 17 where Scott finished, that if we're children, then we're heirs, like we have an inheritance, and that we're fellow heirs with Christ. Scott talked about that. And then he adds this little clause, provided we suffer with him in order that we all may be glorified with him, which is like so antithetical to what can sometimes be the manipulation of American Christianity.
Right.
Like we think,
like, no, I just got an inheritance. I don't need to suffer.
Like,
I got everything taken care of now.
I'll follow Christ until I suffer.
Right.
And what Paul is saying is, no, you actually are following Christ once you suffer. That's a very different dynamic. And so then he picks up where we were this week around this idea of like, hey, I know that I'm suffering, but I actually wouldn't even compare the suffering that I have right now to the glory that's waiting in front of me. Like it's not comparable. And we talked a little bit about the stack of suffering that Paul walked out in his life. He's not just using this as a throwaway line. He's not saying some people unfriended me on Facebook. Like this guy was, there were attempted murder convictions on other people, likely because of what they were trying to do to Paul during his life. And so he was shipwrecked. He was whipped a bunch of times. And so for him, he's going, yeah, when I think about what's coming, and he's not just talking about someday, one day, this disembodied state in heaven. He's saying, when I think about the new heavens and the new earth, when I think about the kingdom of heaven on earth, when I think all this being put back the way that it's designed to be, when I think about that, this suffering is nothing, right? Because he knows sort of the plate that he just set one verse earlier. He knows that he just said to people, you're only really following God when you're suffering. You're like, wait a second, how much suffering? Well, let me just tell you guys, the suffering that I've had, which is probably worse than all of you, I don't even think it's worth comparing. I don't think it holds a candle to the glory that's waiting for us in eternity. And so we talked about this idea that God is working in our waiting, that as we're waiting, we feel like, God, are you listening? Do you care? God is doing all this stuff, just like he waited for the right and perfect time to bring Jesus about. He's waiting for the right and perfect time to restore all of heaven and all of earth. And so this kind of idea of longing, we talked about that there's, if you're a follower of Jesus, there's kind of a belonging that can only be found in honest longing, that when we're honest with one another about, this is my shortcoming, this is where I'm hurting or failing, this is something I'm grieving in the world, and someone else is willing to be that honest about that for themselves, I think there's a deeper bond in following Jesus, because it's not like we're just saying that's awful, that's so hard or painful. We're saying together we are acknowledging that there's something bigger than this that we were made for, and that God is working on even right now. Jesus said when he ascended to heaven, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Yeah. And again, he's not just talking about like the way that sometimes we think about it. I'm building your mansion in heaven. Really, Jesus is doing the work to bring about the restoration of all things here, and new heavens and new earth. And so to be able to understand the circumstantial steps of fulfilling prophecy and being patient with the human race so that we would be co-heirs in the new heavens and the new earth, this forever kingdom with God, hopefully it gives us encouragement that just like Paul, even when we're going through something difficult, we go, well, this doesn't hold a candle to what I'm anticipating, to what I'm hoping for. And even to be able to look around and see natural disasters and the pain points of the world around us that are real, and we don't want to minimize the hurt or the impact or even the loss of life, but to say even creation itself is saying this isn't the way it's supposed to be. I can feel it, right? At one point in the scriptures it says if we won't worship God, the rocks will cry out, right? And so it's this idea that we are the only we are the only created being by God with an agency of choice. Like we're the only ones that don't get it, that there's a creator beyond us. The rest of them are instinctively agonizing for the sake that the world is not working the way that it was designed to work. And hopefully in the middle of that, right, a sense of hope to be able to say, there is a delay. It's not where I want it to be today. But even though that's still true, we can look around, see followers of Jesus making a difference, trying to make the world a better place in the name of Jesus, bringing hope to the hopeless. And Paul says that's like the first fruits, right? It's like the harvest is coming. You can see that it's growing, and it's just the very first fruits of it. You're watching, and every time you see them, they should remind you that what's showing up in like little spots here and there will eventually be everything.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's encouraging, and for people to think about, okay, so what does that help me choose to see? I said that line, some things have to be believed to be seen, right? Like we have this idea of seeing is believing, but I think in the framework of God, actually, oftentimes it's the exact opposite, that believing is the only way that we'll see it.
Yeah.
And so hopefully for you, maybe this week, there's something that you couldn't see before, couldn't trust in before. It felt miserable. It felt interminable. It felt like there was an inevitability to whatever was coming. And I hope I hope that our text in Romans 8 gave you hope.
Yeah. I'd love to just dive in a little bit more about what the intersection between suffering and pain and the hope, not the hope that in the worldly sense of hope, but the hope that we have in Jesus. Let's talk about more about that intersection and how important and crucial that is. Phil.
Yeah. Well, James 1, 2 through 4, I'm sure we've talked about before, right? Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing the testing of your faith produces endurance. Endurance produces perseverance. Perseverance ultimately leaves you perfect, lacking in nothing. It's like this idea that perseverance through trial is a part of it. And actually Romans 5, Paul does the same thing. He says, therefore, since we've been justified by faith, like we've been saved, we've been set clear or set free, we've been made righteous, we have peace, we have this inner tranquility with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him we've also obtained access by faith into the grace which we stand. And then he says, we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So, this is 3 chapters earlier than where we are in Romans 8. And Paul does this a lot, where he kind of like sprinkles in these key themes throughout the letter so that we would be reminded of it. And we all know this to be true. Like every other area of our life, we know that it takes sort of breaking down to building up. The easiest example of this is like working out. And so if you do a bunch of work and you're lifting a bunch of weight, you kind of know, hey, the next day I'm going to be sore, right? Like my muscles are regularly breaking down to build up. We understand that in a bunch of places. And I think for whatever reason, sometimes it gets disconnected, and we have this version of our faith that's like, it's only ever up and to the right. It's never painful. I should never experience hardship. And I think there's extremes. Like I think there are people that they don't think they deserve a good day. So even when everything's going well, they're like, I'm just waiting for things to get terrible again. Kind of the Eeyore Christians. And then I think there are other Christians, sometimes because they've been taught to believe this. I talked about this a little bit through sort of the prosperity gospel. And they believe actually that in this life, they should never experience pain, hardship, difficulty, lack of supply, that's always a statement of faith deficit. Like if they just believed harder, if they just prayed harder, if they just said it louder. And neither one of those extremes are helpful. One of the lines that I'll say from Romans 5 is that hope that helps, it hurts to get. And like if we really want hope that matters in our life, it's heavy hope. Like it took something to get there.
Yeah.
And so when we want a comfortable, easy life, okay, like that'll work for you. Like hope in Jesus will work for you as long as your life stays as easy as it is right now. But the moment it's really painful, the moment you feel a big setback, what are you going to do about it? And I hope this passage can encourage people that say, I wasn't sure how God was going to use this, or if God could use this, or why God would allow this. And at the end of this passage to go, there's this giant cosmic timeline that God is working, and God is going to use it in a micro way. God is going to grow you through it. God is going to show something to you that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And if you could see the grand scheme of eternity, you would see how the story that God is writing in your life, even the difficult things, second-class causation he's allowing in your life as a sovereign God, is ultimately a part of this grand plan to bring restoration to the heavens and the earth.
Yeah. How can I comfort people about that second part?
Yeah. Well, some of that we're going to get to at the end of Romans 8. That's kind of the crescendo. Like, Paul isn't quite trying to answer that question yet in Romans 8. But I think that a lot of times what we want to do is we want to write people's future script.
Yeah.
So we want to say, like, well, let's talk about how God might use this in your life.
So good.
And I just think that that is often well-intentioned, but people are both not ready to hear it most of the time. And I think it can feel really dismissive because, like, we're probably talking to them about something that maybe either we aren't experiencing or haven't experienced. Yeah. And it can feel like you're not allowed to grieve this. So let me tell you that I think we have to be careful about that. But the pattern for the Jewish people, it was these things. If you've ever heard, Here I Raise My Ebenezer, if you've ever heard that in a song, that's a reference to a pattern that the Jewish people would have where actually they would create kind of these like miniature statues or these small monuments in all the places that God had shown up in miraculous ways, right? If you think about it, they didn't have the internet. Nobody was taking pictures and putting them on the gram. Like, it was just, they were largely illiterate. And so figuring out how do we remember this stuff, they would build these places of remembrance. And then with subsequent generations were in those places, every one of those, it sort of became like this reminder, right? It was like a historic geographic geocached book to say, hey, Mom, Dad, what was this for? And they go, oh, man, you won't believe it. Back when so-and-so was alive, God delivered us from insert thing, right? Yep. Oh, that's when God showed up in this amazing and special way. And so I think when you're, I think it's really, there's lots of discernment because depending on what's happened to someone, I think you've probably heard me say this before, the more pain, the less words. So if somebody comes to you and they just lost a child, just be quiet.
Yeah.
Just be quiet and cry with them and recognize that reflects exactly what Romans 8 is talking about, right? Like, just creation is moaning and agonizing that it's not the way it's supposed to be. Yep. So the more pain, the less words. But I think as discernment gives you, as the Spirit gives you discernment to be able to say, I think kind of the next ratchet up from complete silence is, hey, can I just tell you, it's not the same situation, but can I just tell you a story in my life that was really hard, that I didn't think God could possibly use or show up in, and it wasn't overnight, and it hurt, and it took a long time, and I don't know what the story for you is, but it's given me confidence that even in the most difficult times, God can still show up. And then I think the third one, if you know the person well, depending on the circumstance, is to surface something in their life. Yeah. And I have a friend right now who's going through some really hard stuff, and kind of walking through it. Some days in a better place about it, some days in a harder spot about it. But I walked with him through some hard stuff just a few years ago. And as we're talking, it was like, well, a lot of catastrophizing, like this is never gonna, it's always gonna, I can't ever. And I just said, hey, man, can we talk about this thing that happened 3 years ago? Do you remember how bad it was, man? Do you remember where we were when we talked about this? Do you remember how you were doing? Remember the kinds of things you were saying? Like, dude, just how did it go? And then for him to be able to say, yeah, dude, I didn't know that we were ever going to climb out of it, and we ended up in a better place than we were before, and we wouldn't have gotten there without that crisis. Like, hey, dude, I don't know what God's going to do, but I know if he could do that then, he can do it again. Yeah. And so I think that, again, I just think I would avoid writing future scripts on people's current pain, because when we do that, it feels very dismissive. Like, oh, well, maybe God's doing this because he wants to make your marriage better. No, probably just...
God can't give you what you can't handle.
Right. Yeah. We'll get to that in Romans 8:28.
I hope so.
But I think, one, more pain, less words. Just sit and don't be afraid to cry and grieve. There's a season for all of it. 2, what are sort of your stones of remembrance that you can bring up for people that you know and trust? Yep. And 3, if you've been in it with them for a long time, what are their stones of remembrance that you can, with kindness, remind them of? It's the way that God's people did in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's what Jesus often did in his teaching to remind people back, and I think it's what Paul tells us would often be the way our faith would grow in the midst of suffering.
Yeah, you hinted at this in your message, but the importance of relationships and community and walking with each other and reminding each other of this the hope that we have in suffering is just huge. So let's double click on that for a second, Phil. How has community, how has people in your life, like the relationships that you have, how integral has that been to you as you have lost sight of the hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think we say this semi-regularly, that faith is a team sport. It was never designed to be done alone. And the best time to build your team is before you need it. And a lot of people, they want to go like, all right, who's my crew? In the midst of their pain, and you're like, oh no, like this is kind of too late, man. Like
it's the fourth quarter. I'm down by how many points? I need that person.
Yeah, exactly right. Or like the storm is coming, and you're going, man, I really need storm windows. Like you needed storm windows like a year ago, bro.
Yeah, people don't know what storm windows are.
Yeah, that's true. Like thicker windows.
Fire insurance. I don't know.
Oh gosh.
A power bank.
Yeah. Oh man, praise the Lord. Yeah, power bank, generator.
Yeah.
Like you do all that stuff before the storm comes.
Yeah.
And so I think if you don't have a community in your life, if you're in the middle of something, ask for help. We want to help. But I would say understand some of what it is going to weather through the storm. And as you do it alone, or as you do it just with the help of some pastors in your life, go, I'm committed that before the next one of these comes, I'm going to invest in relationships. And if you're like, I don't think I need that, I'm good right now, man, it is the perfect time to build that relationship core, because you will need it. It's not like living with the other shoe going to drop, but we live, like Paul's talking about, we live in a world that's groaning. We live in a world that's longing. Even our own soul is telling us that. Like we can just feel it. And to be able to have people around you that help you discern the difference between what I want right now and what I need long term, can hold us accountable when we start to get off track, can be with us when the world falls apart. I think that stuff all feels maybe more essential than ever before. And I would say, kind of dipping back into the political ideology conversation, in as much as you can, have people that are in that circle that challenge some of your assumptions. So if you're like a super strong Democrat, and you're like, oh, it's really hard for me to see how anybody could ever vote Republican, try to have somebody in your core that does. Or if you're like, oh my goodness, I'm super strong Republican, I can't imagine somebody following Jesus that's a Democrat, try to have somebody that's in your close core that's a Democrat. Because those people are also, I think, going to help us be reminded that not all of our core assumptions are correct. I had a buddy that was talking about like kind of background and foreground values. It's a like psychological concept that culturally there are these background values. In America, it'd be like freedom, there's these background values that we all agree to. Yeah. And then there are foreground values that are different. Like I want to live this way. I'm into this thing. Here's the choice that I would make. And in a capitalistic structure, the thing that happens is more and more individualization. We talked about this in Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. More and more of our values are getting pushed from background values to foreground values, because in a capitalistic structure, they want to maximize choice. The more choice we have, the more products we'll buy. Right. But I think one of the really big values in having a great core is that you have a group of people where that kind of that set of background values grows. Like I know everybody here is going to have one another's back. I know when that person's in the hospital. I know when that person's kid's in trouble. I know when they color outside the lines over there. We're all in. We're not going to have a debate about it. We're together on it. And so if you don't have that, life groups are a huge piece of that. Reach out to your campus pastor, your associate campus pastor. Get in a life group. If they're like, oh, we'll put you on a list, get on the list, man. Like that is so absolutely critical, and a great way to form community, honestly, is to start serving somewhere. Even if you aren't in a life group yet, or the life group isn't meeting this summer, just get in a place where you have more of those shared background values with people that are going to encourage you when you need it, and are going to challenge you when you need it to.
So good. That's great, Phil. That perfectly sets up our question for the week, and that was a text-in question. I mean, if you please send in your questions, we love sharing your voices and your perspective on the podcast. You can text us at 650-600-0402. And this question is about, hey, my life group kind of broke for summer for a little bit. We had a lot of people traveling. What are some books that you might recommend, podcasts to listen to? How can I stay connected and growing in this like 1 month break?
Totally. What a great question.
It's a fantastic question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I recommended that book already earlier called Learning to Disagree. There's also a podcast, maybe I've mentioned it on here before.
The Menlo Midweek podcast?
The Menlo that's what it is. It's incredible. The Menlo Midweek podcast.
Okay,
That's what the kids call a subtweet, right?
Yeah.
Or meta or whatever. So there's a podcast called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Have we talked about this podcast before?
I don't know who we have.
It's the host of it is Justin Brierley.
Okay.
He is a dude in the UK, so he's got a cool accent. And
He already sounds smarter.
right, yeah. Basically, the premise of the podcast is that we had kind of the rise of the religiously disaffiliated, the nuns, if you will.
Okay.
And it looks like sociologically the early returns are on a global level that has peaked, that the point at which kind of the rise of the religious disaffiliated, that's sort of leveled off. And a lot of it is attributed to post 9/11, what was called the New Atheist Movement. And there were a bunch of books that got released and a bunch of prominent atheists that were going around to college campuses. And then stuff like YouTube and podcasts became popularized. So before, some of those arguments, you would have had to go like sit in a lecture hall.
Right.
And now you could just find them on the internet. And as those arguments, really largely early on unchallenged, became really prominent, it kind of took the world by storm. And so on the podcast, he documents that history, what those arguments were, why they took such root in places, and really what God has been doing in the lives of some pretty surprising people. Anything I recommend is never going to be like a full endorsement. Bring your brain to the conversation, but I think it's a helpful podcast if you're kind of just going, oh, what do I listen to? For me, I'm always thinking like when I'm on a run. Yep. Or when I'm riding my bike, I like legitimately look forward to like what am I going to listen to, and I really do enjoy those. And then there's a great book if you're as nerdy as I am. It's a longer one by John Dixon. There's a book called Bullies and Saints, and it's a book about basically church history through the like intellectually honest pursuit of, hey, here's where abuses took place in the church, here's where we missed the mark, and here's how God, oftentimes in spite of us, worked to get us to the point that we're at right now. That's a book I'd recommend. And then one more book I would say, if you haven't read it, not a Christian book at all, Jonathan Haidt, Anxious Generation, I think is another really good one.
Cool.
And if you're in a life group that took the month off, maybe you're not going to like meet as a life group, but an encouraging rhythm that I would say we found over the years is maybe it's like getting together with one other couple, or if you're in a life group that isn't couples, one other person from your life group, and just having a meal or hanging out.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a big production. You guys could meet for coffee. You could go to a restaurant. You could say, I'm going to flip some frozen Costco burgers in my backyard. If you want to, like that, we've done that this summer with people. So I would say if you're going, I'm lonely, I just want to spend time with people, I would say, man, do that. Like make it possible, make it chill, and check in with folks. So it feels like in a month when you guys are reconnecting, it doesn't feel like it's been a year since you've been around each other.
That's great.
What do you think though? Like in your life, you go, hey, I summertime, some of my faith rhythms maybe are disrupted. What do you find helpful other than fly fishing?
Other than fly fishing, not much. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, intentional time with either certain people that are around for the summer or members of the group. Like it's a great time if you do have a larger group to identify, hey, like I want to take each couple out or each person out for that. I also think too, figuring out and spending time with yourself or with your partner and making sure that is good, and having space to figure out what brings you connection to God. Whether that's reading, whether that's fly fishing, whether that is, I don't know, going to the beach and watching the ocean. But carving out time to specifically get and reflect over the past year, write some stuff down, write some stuff, some hopes, sit with God. It's funny. As I'm in a seminary class now around discipleship, and thinking about what discipleship looks like and how each day, and we've mentioned this, it goes hand in hand with kind of something that you've said over the last month or two, of basically like we're always being formed either more towards God or away from God,
Right.
whether we know it or not. So summertime, we don't just hit pause and pick up where we left off, but we're being shaped in that summer, in that summertime. So bringing that to the front of mind and just putting in good rhythms and finding out ways in which God uniquely connects with you.
I think that's great. And I think that I love the idea of leveraging the summer for kind of like annual review rhythms, because I think most of us, even if you don't have kids, most of us, our lives are actually driven more by like the school year calendar than the December or the January to December calendar.
Absolutely.
And when we do it as like a, hey, we should reflect, it becomes like 3 days between Christmas and New Year's. And our New Year's is probably already figured out. Like we probably already have stuff on the schedule. So I love the idea of saying, hey, what if we thought about in our context here, kind of like that, when stuff picks back up in August, what are the things personally, professionally, spiritually, even emotionally, relationally, that I need to do something different about this, and I don't need to wait till December or January when I'm going to be panicked and pushed to do it. I can think about it now. Maybe that's with better weather. Maybe that's on a beach. Maybe that's with a fly rod in your hand. I think that's a great rhythm, man. I like that a lot.
Awesome. Well, Phil, thanks so much.
Of course, yeah. Thanks you.
Anything else you want to let people know about before we break today?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we are starting some pretty important conversations at Menlo right now, and I'm having them kind of in smaller gatherings with individuals, and we think that God's calling us to do some pretty big stuff, and you may have already gotten or will be getting an invitation to be a part of that conversation. Eventually, everybody will be a part of that conversation later on in the fall, but it's just one of those things that we're spending a lot of time praying about, and you don't know much about it potentially, but I would say if you would just join us in praying for the future that God wants for Menlo. And hey, this thing that Menlo's doing, this big initiative that we're going to kick off this fall, would you pray that we would hear the voice of God in the middle of it, that we would be faithful to it, not just like as leaders of Menlo, but as people that call Menlo our church. So it's taken up a lot of my time these days, a lot of my brain space. I believe God's called us to do it, and it's really big.
Yep. Thank you.
Of course.
And if you're hearing that, and if you're go into, wait, what is he talking about? These are good big things that are happening.
Good big things.
Yes.
Good big things.
Yes.
Yep.
And so appreciate your leadership on that, Phil. Appreciate the people that are leaning in as well. Appreciate the people like Jeremy, who's here helping recording today, who have said, yeah, I want to get more involved as I have some time this summer. And so if that's you, we'd love to meet you at a campus, whether it's your first time there or if you're at a campus now and maybe you aren't serving or you aren't in a life group, we'd love to chat with you. You could stop by Info Central this weekend when you're there, email or message someone from that campus. We'd love to get you connected so that you can meet those people, to have them around in your life so that when things do go awry, you're already set up. So have a great weekend, everyone. Text us if you need anything, and we'll see you soon.
See you soon, everybody.
Bye.